Hi, everyone. I'm Evan Varation. I am the coordinator of our Clarence School District Family Support Center. And tonight, in a part of our series that we're doing around substance use, we have Amelia Peck with us today from Best Self Behavioral Health, who's going to be talking to our audience and you all that might be watching about substance use and specifically kind of how to support our adolescents and our young people within our community. So for those of you who are in attendance, thank you. And I'll leave it to Amelia to kind of get us started here.
Oh. That's okay. Hello, good evening. Oh, I'm really short compared to you, so let me move this.
Okay.
And I have
maybe one
height problems.
This guy up here a little bit too.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay.
Great. Good evening. So like Evan said, my name is Amelia Peck. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm out of Best Self Behavioral Health. I'm the director of optimization for adolescent services. And I will say, since we are recording this and we have people here present, if you guys have questions throughout the presentation, just feel free to ask anytime and I can repeat them so that they're heard on the recording, and then we can go from there. But we can be very flexible and casual here today. So what I really want to be highlighting for everyone today is some psychoeducation on just trending substances and risk factors for adolescents, prevention and early intervention at home, as well as starting the conversation with your children, whether it's when you're feeling like they might be at risk or just wanting to talk to them about it in general because you're hearing things. So we can kind of have a discussion around that as well. So like I said, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and a little bit on my background. I began my clinical work back in California. I went to graduate school in Pasadena, and I lived in Los Angeles for 10 years where I started working. I worked with high-risk foster children in the adolescent area, or in the Los Angeles area, and I've also worked at group practices. I've worked with probationers and parolees, and I've had a lot of diverse experience. I've worked in recovery clinics and treatment homes, so I have a lot of substance use mental health background, and I really enjoy the integration of the two because I think it's very important to think about how one is affecting the other, and we're going to touch on that in our presentation today. I'm currently at Best Self Behavioral Health. I started there back in 2017, about 3 weeks after I moved to Western New York. And I always joke around when people ask about that is because when I interviewed, my moving van was lost, and I interviewed with our current COO in flip-flops because I had no shoes. So yeah. And I just want to say I'm really grateful for those of you who are here. And I do just want this presentation to be something that helps support you in what you're trying to do with your children and in the schools and things like that. Please feel free to ask any substance use question. I'll do my best to answer. As I'll talk about a lot, substance use is an ever-evolving area. So it's almost impossible to have all the answers all the time, but we'll do our best. And I always like to say, anytime I do a training or presentation, that no question is silly or stupid or small. And it's very likely someone else has the same question, they're just not asking it. So first we're gonna go over some basics. This is gonna be the biggest chunk of heavy information. And so I won't be reading everything on the slide. There's more information there than I'll say. I'm going to try to just kind of highlight what I really want to be some of the takeaways of it. And so like I just said, no one knows everything about all substances. Lots of times if you go to a substance use training or conference, they'll kind of make the joke that if you haven't been to a training in 6 months, then you're 6 months out of date, because it's just the reality and the nature of that culture. And having just some basic knowledge, we just want to make sure you feel like a little bit more confident if you have to start having a harder conversation with someone in your home or someone in your life. And no one is ever, like I said, expected to be an expert on drugs. And so we don't pretend to be. If I'm working with an adolescent or an adult, whether it's at clinic or I'm meeting with a clinician who needs help on a case, I don't take the position of assuming I know everything. I'm always often looking things up on my phone and looking for answers, and I love looking at articles and things like that. So there's always such new information out there that's interesting, and I just hope that, if anything, this is kind of a launching pad to kind of I don't know, maybe interest you in looking at something deeper if there's something that comes up that you want more information on. So we're going to start with cannabis. This is definitely the most popular topic I think that comes up with adolescents because it's just very commonly used right now. It's just a lot of the reality. There's two different types of the cannabis strain. There's sativa and indica. And so it's kind of like daytime, nighttime. And the reason why I kind of highlight this is because people who are, especially now that it's becoming more legal and more widespread, people are starting to engineer different blends of it, and you'll hear a bunch of different types of it in the news and things like that. If you're hearing about stuff that's been either detained by police or celebrities are using it, they're using it for different things. So these are the two different big types. CBD oil is also very trendy right now. It's everywhere. K2 is the synthetic cannabis. And then dabs we're going to get into in a minute. But just a quick note, I like to say on like all the CBD and, you know, the medical marijuana and things like that, the reality is the research is very limited. It's not super in depth. So there are a lot of people who do feel some benefits. And we're going to talk later about how, you know, people do feel positive attributes of using substances and how to incorporate that when we're talking about substance use with people. But at the same time, also understanding that, you know, all the information that's out there about how it's so great and it's like can heal anything, that's not necessarily super research based. It's very what we call anecdotal, which means like somebody had a really good story about how it helped them and now everyone's like catching on to that. So dabs is kind of what is a bigger trend with cannabis. It's cannabis concentrate. It's basically when they take the oil and they they concentrate it. So it's the term is kind of a dab because just a dab will do ya. So one joint is basically the same as one dab. And these are different types of cannabis concentrate. So there's shatter, crumble, butter, oil, wax is another really common one that people use. And something to look for if you're a parent and you're wondering if this is a risk in your home is often vegetable glycerin is something that people use to cut the dabs to put it in a vape pen or something like that. So unless your adolescent has a hobby of soap making, vegetable glycerin probably is not in your home because that's the only other thing that I really know vegetable glycerin is used for. And I really like these images because I think it's very important to know what is biologically happening in your body when this is going on. Because lots of times when we're talking with adolescents or young adults or whoever it is, when we're talking about the substances and why it is they're using, there's huge social components to it. There's a lot of social pressure. They're not wanting to give it up. And there's such a biological impact that happens. You know, we know that children's brains are developing until they're about 25. So if this is what your brain is starting to look like at 16 and you're continuing to daily use marijuana, the realities of what your brain can look like in the end is very scary. This is reflecting, so obviously you can see on the left side is a healthy brain and on the right side is a 16-year-old daily user. And the holes is representing lack of blood flow to the brain. So it's where your brain is not working at its optimal way to function. I know a lot of the deficits that come, it can come in like habit making and habit forming, concentration, things like that. So if this is happening for a long time, it can cause very long-term damage going into adulthood when you're wanting to function at a higher level. Yes.
What type of scan is that?
Sure. So this is a SPECT scan. This is from the Amen clinics. So Daniel Amen, he is out of Newport, California. He is a psychiatrist that I like to follow. He does these SPECT scans on all kinds of things. It's very interesting to look at. I have a few others in this presentation too, but even just for mental health in general, he scans people who are struggling with schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, ADHD. And then what he does in his practice is he kind of prescribes based on where the deficits are in the brain. So it's just a really interesting way of looking at mental health and research. So again, this is a top brain. So I'm sorry, this is from the bottom of your brain up. So this is kind of really looking at the inner brain and the middle brain. This is from the top of the brain down. So we can see where there's deficits coming on both ends. So vaping is another big trend that we're seeing everywhere. The electronic e-cigarettes, and the reason why they are so popular is they're very discreet. I remember when these started becoming popular, I was working in a residential home for people in recovery, and it was very challenging to even almost like know where the boundary was with it, because vaping initially kind of came out for the intention of helping someone quit cigarette smoking. And then it just kind of became, I would kind of, my saying, just how I experienced it with my clients, it was almost like a pacifier for them. It was just such kind of that tangible thing that they had to use and put in their mouth and smoke in some way. And that becomes a big problem. And what can happen is people are vaping at such a high frequency, it's causing incredible pulmonary risks and a lot of other challenges too. Research is showing that about 30% of high school students report vaping, but I would definitely say this is very underreported. Some New York State regulations just to be aware of. They are starting to put a lot more risk of pulmonary effects. It used to have no risk, and now they are having to put similar signage on them as you would for a nicotine cigarette. But they have raised the age in New York State also. You have to be 21 to buy them. It can't be 18 anymore. So, and in the pictures you can see here, they're just very discreet. They look like flash drives. You could definitely see one on a desk or something and not totally know what it is. They come in all different forms and shapes. And so if you're starting to see anything like this around your home or you're wondering what it is, definitely ask, confiscate it, ask what it is. And even kind of start looking it up online, because there's all kinds of different forms you can see. And this is where I say we're hiding in plain sight. So substance use apparel is very common. So the hat is what's called a stash hat. These are and you can see it's discreet. There's nothing on this hat that looks like, oh, that kid's definitely got something in there. They're very muted looking, and they have a little pocket right behind the forehead area where you can stash some of your supply. This is very common for people taking stuff into schools, who are dealing it to people or just carrying their own supply. The hoodies, they are vape hoodies, and what it is, it's on one of the straps, you have the vape attached to it, and then you can just kind of appear to be almost like sucking on the other string, and it's going through. You can get these on Amazon. They're about $30. So it's just really symbolizing how much of a culture there is, and how, like I say, it's just kind of hiding in plain sight. There's a lot of culture where it's just not even concerned about covering it up anymore, I guess you could say. So a few more New York State laws, especially regarding cannabis, because I know this is a huge thing we get in our clinics, is that, everyone's coming in like, oh, well, it's legal now and it's legal now. The thing is, if you're not 21, it's still not legal for you. So we do highlight that a lot when we're working with adolescents, because there can still be some, repercussions if you are caught with any kind on a school campus or somewhere like that. So this is kind of what you're allowed to have. You can have up to 3 ounces on you, or 24 grams of concentrated cannabis. That's like the dabs. It's not allowed in motor vehicles. And I think that's one of the real risks, is that, when someone's pulled over for alcohol, you can do a breathalyzer test. And currently we don't have something like that for cannabis use. And that can make on the road a real risk. So it's definitely something to be mindful of. Do not get in cars with anybody who's been smoking or using, because also the levels of potency of the THC, which is the active ingredient in cannabis, which makes you high, that can vary at different levels. So sometimes you don't know how strong it is, and you don't know how it's affecting the person who has ingested it. So obviously everyone knows what alcohol is, but I just wanted to put in a little note on like the Alka Pops or the seltzers. We are seeing a huge spike in adolescents drinking the Trulies and the High Noons and things like that, because they're just so much more widespread right now. And I think the fact that so many of the cans will say like just 100 calories and things like that, you have diet culture that also gets into that. So we just are very mindful of it. We're especially seeing this among like adolescent girls. Yeah, so I just put that in there just as kind of to be aware of, and especially because I think there's a lot of adults and parents who like to have these in their home. I mean, I will say I have some in my home. I enjoy them as well. But I think if you have someone in your home who is struggling with their own alcohol usage or resisting it, you might have to be kind of assessing the rules in your home around alcohol. Yes.
These look a lot like popular drinks, like energy drinks or
Yes.
fancy soda pop.
Absolutely.
What should people be looking for on labels? Like, where should your eye go to right away to find out that it's actually alcoholic?
Sure. So lots of times you'll see that some of them come from either a brand that's like Bud Light has their own seltzer. So there are some that are creating them. Anything that says hard on it, that means there's probably alcohol content on it. It will also be on the label that there is some alcohol percentage in the drink. It's yes, you have to put the percentage of alcohol volume that is in there, percentage. I believe that is a legal requirement. So, and this just kind of reflects, you know, this is the brain of someone who's a moderate wine drinker. So lots of people will say, you know, a glass of red wine a day isn't that big of a deal. It's good for your blood flow. It's healthy and things like that. And we can kind of see that from this brain scan, that is not necessarily the case. There are huge deficits in the brain if you are regularly using alcohol. Alcohol is not good for blood flow. We know it also causes more fat to be stored in the body and things like that. So there's a lot of biological impact that comes from overuse of alcohol. Whippets are a fun one. I just think the name is funny, but whippets are an inhalant. And basically this is the next slide I kind of use. So if you're wondering like what a whippet is, it's those nitrous oxide containers that are used to pump with whipped cream, spray paint, anything that is like a spray in that way has this nitrous oxide in it. And people use it. It's a very fast high. It makes you feel a little almost like dissociative and just a little lightheaded and things like that. But the reality is what you can see here on the right, there are some very serious long-term effects if you are using whippets very regularly. And what we do see often in adolescents is kids are getting like a box of these and they will go through the whole box just like one after the other after the other. And so it gives you a little bit of this dissociative effect. You're a little bit lightheaded. And then again, it's just the risk of behavior. You know, we don't know how it's going to necessarily impact somebody. We don't want them driving a car or anything like that. So this goes a little bit to your comment about saying, you know, they kind of look like energy drinks and things like that. So Four Loko was on the scene for a while and then it went away because it was so awful. And then it came back. So it was originally sold with caffeine and alcohol. And then they just took out the caffeine. So now they still have the alcohol, but these are sold in gas stations. I actually see these sometimes like outside the cooler near the cash register, and kids will steal them. They'll put them in their pockets and things like that. And what's so dangerous about these is one, they're super cheap. And two, I think they're like $2 or something. They're like really cheap. But the other thing is one Four Loko is like 4.5 beers. So what is happening is kids will steal these and then they go outside the gas station and they will chug them. And it is like chugging 4.5 beers worth of alcohol. So they will very soon be very drunk. And again, we have behavioral risk and things like that. And also there's risk of alcohol poisoning and other things that come into play in this. So yes, this looks like an energy drink, like you were saying. It's obviously very marketed to kids with the colors and the logo and things like that. This doesn't like scream adult sophisticated beverage. Cough syrups are, I think they were kind of really popular for a while and they've kind of come back. So it's Dexine is what it's called. It's when you mix cough syrup with soda like Mountain Dew or Sprite. Robitussin is a really popular one that gets used for this. So it can be called like robotripping or robodosine. I always have to say this name slowly. Dextromethorphan. I haven't done this training in a while, so it takes me a second to say it. But that's the active ingredient that is used in this. If you go on message boards like Reddit and things like that on social media where these conversations are very lively and popular, DXM is the abbreviation they use for this. So if someone says they're Dexine or something, this is how they will write it. So it is a legal cough suppressant that's found in over-the-counter cough syrups, but if you drink it in high dosage, it gives you a dissociative aesthetic. And then there's lean. This is more considered if you're using the prescription strength. So if it has like codeine or things like that in it. But basically lean is when you mix the cough syrup with like a Sprite and then a candy. It's very trendy right now to I think use like the buy drinks that they use that are in grocery stores, gas stations, drugstores, whatever. And the reason it's called lean is because if you drink too much of it, you get a little sleepy and you start to lean. That's how you can remember why it's called that. And just to show how accessible this is where you can buy lean on Amazon. So you can buy it already mixed, and this is how, so, I mean, it's not checking ages, it's not checking anything. If somebody had access to their parents' Amazon account, they could absolutely buy this for themselves and get it shipped to them. Mushrooms are very popular, and the thing is with mushrooms that I think is important to highlight is, one, there's a lot of discussion right now about use of microdosing and mushrooms for treatment of depression and treatment of anxiety. And this is kind of where I say to my point earlier, there's not every association with substance use is going to be negative. And so when you're having that discussion with somebody about what they're using and why they're using, I think it's very important to help to try to understand what gains they think they're getting out of it or what those benefits are. There are some prescribers that will work with people in doing mushrooms and microdosing and do it in a very controlled setting. And that's kind of someone's personal choice to do it that way, the way I see it. What I get concerned about is when somebody is getting access to this and they're making their own and it's not a regulated dosage, because it can absolutely cause you to start hallucinating and having some very different effects of it, which can be very dangerous, and also not knowing how long they will affect you. Acid and LSD is something I hear probably most frequently out of our Amherst clinic, I'll say. And I think when I've been referred people personally that have had adolescents with legal problems, it's almost always related to acid. And I think the reason is because the way it affects you is so quick, and then you feel very out of control of your body. You start to make very impulsive decisions that can be very dangerous. I know this is going to make me sound very old, but I always think of the movie Almost Famous, when the guy gets on like the top of the house and he screams that he's a golden god and and then he dives into the pool when he's on acid. And it's just because it can give you a very grandiose, when you're on a trip or whatever you want to call it. But when you're having that intoxicated experience, you're not attached to reality. And then candy flipping is what it can be called if you are mixing the acid with ecstasy or MDMA. And that is when you're getting kind of a more dissociative effect with also very, I guess, like heightened sensory, which is often what can be used with like ecstasy. And like I said, always feel free to ask questions because I know I'm like trying to fly through this in the interest of time. So ecstasy or Molly, MDMA, it's very recreational. It's a party drug. Kids use it a lot because they just start to feel very loose and very carefree and things like that. It also affects you very quickly. You can probably start to feel it within 30 minutes or so, and it'll last like 3 to 6 hours. So it's kind of very common to like go out and do ecstasy, and then you kind of burnt it off before you wake up the next morning. Yes.
Those look like nice manufactured little tablets. Where did those?
That is a great question. I don't know where this picture specifically got their pills, but it does speak, I think, to a much broader issue that there are, and this is in the news a lot, if you look for this right now, is there are a lot of candies and things that are being seized, and they are finding that they are laced with things like fentanyl and things like that in them, and they do look like candies. They look like little Skittles or something like that. So I would say if you if you see anything that looks like it's not a candy that you're familiar with, I think that can be just kind of, because I think sometimes, when I've talked to parents and they're like, oh, I don't want to just like assume everything is drugs. I don't think you have to assume everything is drugs, but I think if you do see something that you're not sure what it is, I would definitely ask about what it is. I wouldn't just assume it's not at the same time. And then, so I kind of want to touch on pharmaceuticals. Where's the water bottle? So this is something that we see as an issue, and I will say, yes, there are issues with like opioid use and things like that, but at the same time, I think some of the biggest pharmaceutical concerns I have with adolescents is when they are prescribed medication and they are not taking it as directed by their doctor. I remember very early on when I was at Best Self and I was trying to help people train and just kind of get a little bit more educated on things around pharmaceuticals. A clinician who thought this client had no substance use problems came into the office I was at, and she was like, oh, we have a big problem because she's supposed to only take her anti-anxiety medication right after school, and she took twice the dose before school. And so now she's like falling asleep at school and we like can't wake her up. And I was like, oh my gosh. And she was like, oh, but no, this isn't like a substance use case. And I was like, no, this absolutely is a substance use case, because you're having somebody who's taking something that's been prescribed by a doctor, but at a time that they are not prescribed to take it and at a dosage that they are not prescribed to take it. So adherence to how it is prescribed you is very important, and to be monitoring that. Stimulants and like ADHD medication we'll get into as well. But I also just take this time to say, when you're hearing about something, whether it's something that you hear somebody is taking, whether it's something they're prescribed or something they found or whatever it is, just Google what you don't know. There's lots of times I sit and I work with clients and I'll always ask at the beginning of treatment, do you take anything that is either prescribed or recreationally? And sometimes they'll tell me whatever medication they're taking, and I'm like having to like type it in, being like, what is that one again? Because there's just so many medications out there. It's impossible to know everyone and what the side effects are and everything. So I'm not saying use Google as like Dr. Google to diagnose anything, but just for some good information around what is out there and what it does, it is very good for that. So this goes back. So you were asking a minute ago, where did they get those pills? So these are pressies or pressed pills, which basically is a term for a pill that did not come from a pharmacy. It's like a street-made pill. And these are pills that you can get off Etsy. So I kind of always joke around. They come from Etsy, so they probably come in a really pretty like canvas bag for you with a bow on it. But these you can buy online. They're $15 and they look like little candies. And there's just a reality. The reality is there's a lot of access to things that are not regulated in terms of what is sold or can be sold. They might say that there are, but it's not really necessarily being enforced. A concern that we see a lot around the pressed pills is pressed Xanax. Excuse me. Because with the restrictions around pharmacy access becoming more restrictive, that you can't like pharmacy hop, this was definitely a thing like in the early 2000s. And I had family members that struggled with this, as they would go to one doctor, get a script, thank you doctor, go pick up their prescription, and they would go to another doctor and say, oh, but this doctor didn't listen to me, so this is what I need. And they'd be like, oh, I've got you. They'd write another script, they go get that, and then they go to another doctor. So you can't do that anymore, which is good. But because of that, the supply and access has gone down, so people are doing more pressed pills. And this is where we will see pills that have contaminants in them, such as fentanyl. This is a big concern, I think, especially when people are looking for the Xanax, is we have actually heard of adolescents who are seeking out Xanax with fentanyl pressed into it. That apparently is something like very specific that is going around. And then also we have seen that some that contain things in them like rat poison and things like that. So, they're just garbage that's in there, quite honestly, and you don't know what it is. It's very dangerous to be taking them. So stimulant use, or like a stim binge, is when people are using things like Adderall and Ritalin at a rate that they're not really prescribed. They might be doubling up the dosage or something to help them focus during school. And something that, Evan and I were talking about when we were talking about this presentation is this is a real temptation, not around the students that you necessarily would think are the drug using students. You know, I often say the kids that you think, I guess like, again, I'm gonna like date myself, but like going to school in like the late 90s, where it's like, you know, this is your brain on drugs. It was always this idea that the person who was using drugs was just like really dirty and like couldn't keep it together and things like that. But the reality is there are lots of people who are very high performing who are using substances to help them cope with that high performance anxiety. And I think these things around the Adderall and Ritalin that help that focus and maintain that focus is very common around students that have a lot of pressure on themselves. Yes.
Has that high performing drug use moved into the school? I would.
Oh,
wouldn't be
absolutely.
surprised if you're gonna help, but no, I haven't had that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the Clarence guy says yes. Yeah, no, it is absolutely in high schools. And so we it's very hard to really manage because obviously there are some kids who are prescribed and they need it just because of different neurodiversity that's out there. But it's also kids are selling their pills if they have a prescription. And this pre-pandemic, I heard they were going for about $10 a pill. My guess is because of inflation, they're probably going for more right now. So if you get a supply, like a 30-day supply of Ritalin, you can sell your bottle at school for $300 a day, and you've made some good money. So that's a big concern that we see. And it's also sometimes used for weight management. So we see that a lot with adolescent girls, college girls, even adult women who are seeking out these substances to use it for weight management. Again, with pharmaceuticals. So this is a trend that happens a lot with adolescents. They're called Skittles parties or farm parties or fishbowl parties, which is basically they get a bowl, they dump a bunch of pills in a bowl. This is what you do at a party. And you don't know if you're taking Tylenol or Xanax or whatever, and whatever you get, you get. And what is very risky about this is you might be someone who you get like a Tylenol the first time. And so you're like, oh, this didn't do anything to me. So you go get something else, and then you get something else. And so we don't know if you're taking something that's interacting with something else. If something did happen and you needed medical attention, you wouldn't be able to tell the doctor what you took. That's very concerning as well, so they wouldn't necessarily know how to treat you. And different medications and different things they use to treat responses to medication, they interact differently. So if you can't inform a doctor very well of what is in your body, they do not know how best to treat you, and it puts you at higher risk. Oh, and a note on this. We also hear a lot of kids that will go to open houses around neighborhoods, and they go into people's medicine cabinets and they look for these things as well. So you just kind of have to think, if you're trying to think of like, where's risk, where do I need to manage risk? And I know even before we started this presentation, we were talking, and there's always kind of this thought like, well, not my kids, like not my house, not in my family. And what we are seeing when we're working with the adolescents in our clinics is the pill use is pretty substantial. And so I think you just have to be mindful of any access points. You know, I have very young children. My oldest one is 8, but even then, you know, we're thinking of, you know, if it's like even over the counter medicine that my husband and I would use, like Benadryl or Tylenol, like we keep that much higher. Just because if we had our 4-year-old who was curious, I mean, that could be like detrimental. And I think the same thing too, you know, we've even had situations at our clinic where, you know, oftentimes we think if we have like a really young kid, we don't need to worry about it so much. But we had a kid recently who needed medical attention because they got a hold of their adolescent siblings' gummies and they ate it like candy, but they were way too young to ingest any kind of THC, and they had to get medical attention. So the access is very concerning. How things look like children's products and candies is always very concerning. And so I think, again, it's just kind of thinking of where are those access points and where are those risks and what are you trying to be mindful of. So opiates and opioids. So this is kind of, you know, heroin, morphine, fentanyl, all that kind of stuff. The Oxycontin was kind of the big explosion of it on the scene when it came out in the pharmaceuticals, and they were really pushing it for pain management. And this is where the opioid epidemic really became very challenging, especially in areas like Western New York, where they have a very industrial history, is people were working these very hard labor jobs and they had horrible pain and they had body ailments, and doctors were getting very heavily criticized for not managing pain well. And so this is kind of when the Oxycontin got really big. And so now we know how addictive it is and how dangerous it is. So I know you guys have had other trainings on this, but if you are worried about someone in your life having access to this or worrying about any kind of overdose, definitely get access to some kind of Narcan, or naloxone is the generic name for it. You can get it at pharmacies. To show them your insurance card and say you need a kit of Narcan. It's super easy to administer. You just spray it up the nose. It's nothing big you have to know how to do. It's so much more simple than it used to be. And I also say with this, I think a lot, going back to that comment of, not my kid, not my family, not my house. When we see adolescents who are struggling with opiates, they all started with cannabis. So if it's something where you think, oh, it's just experimenting with cannabis, it's not a big deal. I always kind of challenge that. And I say, it's still worth having that hard conversation with somebody, because I brought some people into one of our clinics once to do kind of like some psychoeducation and testimonial to our clinicians. And the kid who had been through treatment said the first time he told a therapist when he was 16 that he was experimenting with drugs was the first time he actually thought he had a problem. And he had actually been using for years. He just had never really disclosed it to anybody. And that was kind of his way of testing the waters of like, how will they respond when I say I'm experimenting with drugs? But at that point, he was well into pills and using opiates and things like that. He just claimed he was experimenting with cannabis. So this is, again, the brain scans. So we have the healthy brain on the left and then opiate dependence for 7 years. And you can just see how deteriorated it makes the brain functioning. And if you are with somebody and you are ever worried of an opiate overdose, just something to look for is they kind of fall asleep, because basically what opiates do is they tell your brain that your body has enough oxygen, so it tells your heart to stop beating, and it just slows down, and eventually you will go into like cardiac arrest and you'll overdose. So moving on, kratom is another thing we're seeing a lot. You can get this in gas stations. It kind of has a bit of like a mind-altering effect to it. It's very easy to access on the internet. Comes in gums and extracts and things like that. What I've heard from the people that we work with when we do our toxicology screens is that we have been seeing traces of fentanyl in the kratom that people have been like buying at gas stations, because it's just not regulated. And I think that's the biggest thing to think of, is that people are thinking it's not a big deal. It's just there's no checks and balances to these systems. So it keeps that risk very high. Cocaine, we'll kind of know what cocaine is, but highlighting it for adolescents, because what we hear most often is this is commonly used with adolescent girls, and it is used for weight loss. I think that is the biggest, I guess, like common, I can't think of it, precipitating factor, whatever you want to say, is kind of leading into it. And then an 8-ball, I think people like to throw this phrase around. Maybe they know what an 8-ball is and maybe they don't. The 8-ball is basically just an 1/8 ounce of cocaine mixed with something else. It's often mixed with something like meth, which is the next slide. So meth is like cocaine times 10. And it used to be much more common on the West Coast because it came up from Mexico more often. But we are starting to see it much more often in Western New York now. And again, it kind of is attributing to the same factors with fentanyl and opioids, is that, eventually if your tolerance goes up, you're going to look for something stronger. So if you go from opioids, people will actually start seeking out fentanyl to get the same effect. So it's kind of the same thing with meth. If you've been using cocaine for a while and your body has built up such a tolerance for it, then you'll be seeking out something stronger, and that's when meth comes in. I think the thing is, though, with cocaine and meth, it's and this was on the previous slide, it's more of an emotional addiction than a biological addiction. So with something like alcohol or benzodiazepines, which are like pharmaceuticals, there is a lethal component to just going off of it and suddenly stopping. Like you could actually go into like cardiac arrest if you're a very severe alcoholic or you're very addicted to Xanax and you just stop. That's why we do what we call like medicated detoxing or medicated stabilization, because it helps somebody wean off of that. Meth and cocaine, it's more so you're just addicted to the feeling that you're getting while you're on the substance. And that's kind of what you keep seeking, because you get super, super high really, really fast and you crash super hard to where it's like, if this is your baseline and you get really, really high, you're going to like go like twice down past your baseline. So yeah, it's called ice or glass. Very popular party drug. It gets passed around a lot. It can be smoked, it can be ingested, it can be intravenously used, it can be used in all kinds of ways. So we're going to get into like early prevention and things at home, but did anyone have any questions about any of the substances? If you want to go back to a slide or ask anything about that? Yes. Yeah.
What is the usual form of
I think it's really commonly sold in these powders. I know it is also sold in like a paste where you can literally just kind of like, it looks like a toothpaste tube. That's very common also. And I think people will kind of just like, I've seen people like rub it on their lips. And they kind of like lick it that way, just as kind of having it on them all the time. But yeah, it's similar to other things. It can be mixed with stuff. But I think it often comes in this powder. It can be smoked, it can be put into tea, it can be mixed into something. And I think that's the thing, you know, especially if we're talking about like fentanyl and, you know, there are something there, what you can buy at drugstores is called like a fentanyl testing strip, where you could like put some of the substance in a little bit of water, you dip the strip in it, and then it will tell you if the substance contains fentanyl or not. So in the spirit of harm reduction, which is the approach that we take at our agency, which is a little different than just like the whole, like, just don't do drugs. Although that's kind of obviously, you know, and as myself as a parent, I'm like, just don't do it. Lots of times if people are having these positive factors involved in it too, it's really hard to just totally rip it away and just say like, you have to just stop, because if they're getting such a biological reaction to something, like their body is saying like, you can't stop. So they're really battling with this mind-body connection of it. So if you had something that you weren't sure contained fentanyl, or you were trying to help a loved one test to see if they had fentanyl in their substances, one of the things we sometimes say is we're like, if you had it in the water and it tested negative, you could still like drink the water and ingest it. Just because oftentimes people won't test for fentanyl because they don't want to waste the substance that they have. So I know it's kind of, it sounds like a backwards way of thinking, but the spirit of it is to prevent overdose. And so that's kind of always why we're thinking, you know, even if someone is struggling to stop using, we want to get them some Narcan, or we want to get them something where they can test the substance that they have so that they can be using more safely. And then when they are ready to decrease their using or maybe stop using, we've managed to help them avoid some risk.
Anyone in the community that like fentanyl testing strips in the office?
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Evan. Any other questions before we go on? So this is not like a whole lot of slides on it, and this can definitely be where, if you guys have more questions about ways to have these conversations, we can have more of an interactive approach to it. But I always think, you know, when parents come to me being like, you know, well, what are warning signs? What would you look for? How would you know how to start this conversation? I think similar to almost any kind of substance or mental health problem, you kind of want to be looking for changes in behavior. Is your kid more withdrawn, or maybe they're more like outgoing suddenly, and that's not typical of them? Any kind of change in behavior, I think it's okay to be like, that's different. Let's ask about that. Changes in social group. Sometimes they've gotten an in with a social group that means a lot to be a part of at school, or they've kind of withdrawn into a different social group that maybe has a different tone of friendships, or you're just kind of noticing changes in behaviors in that way. Those are things to be mindful of. Changes in school performance. Are they more engaged, more withdrawn or isolated, and also secretive or defensive behaviors? I think it's always when you're trying to engage in these conversations, I think it's normal to expect some defensiveness. Like, why are you asking me this? Like, don't you trust me? And those kinds of things like that. And I think that that's where it's really important where you have that approach of like, I'm not saying I don't trust you. I'm saying I've heard about this. I've learned about this and I'm concerned. I'm concerned about what do you know? I'm concerned about what have you had access to? I don't know what you're being offered. I'm not saying like rat out all your friends, but I'm just saying I want to be able to have this conversation with you because if you did find yourself in a situation where you were struggling, I would want to know that you could talk to me about it. And I think you just have to have that very kind of open perspective because I think the clients I work with that are very worried about their parents finding out about any kind of substance use they do, they're often worried because it's such a strict, like stringent feeling at home that they're like, oh, if my parents found out, I would, I would lose all privileges to everything. My life would be over or something like that. I think it's also, like I've said a few times during this, keep in mind that not all associations with substances are negative. An example I use often, I got pulled in on a case to do some consulting with, and we had a client, she had experienced some pretty significant trauma, and she really had not slept, had not been able to sleep through the night for years. And suddenly she was sleeping, and the parents found out it was because she was taking cannabis at night. She was smoking before she went to bed, or taking an edible or something like that. So the clinician was like, oh, well, we just need to stop, she has to stop taking the drugs like right away if we're going to do treatment. And I was like, well, I don't know, like, let's talk about that because she experienced like trauma. And then she found, and she couldn't sleep. She couldn't sleep. She was very anxious. She was irritable. And she found cannabis, and now she can sleep and she feels more safe. So for her, the association with cannabis was sleep and safety and peace. And so what we want to do, and this is why, we always want to be sure people know how to access like mental health treatment and things like that, is there are things we can do to help with mental health in terms of decreasing anxiety, helping with sleep, and helping with those habits. And then we can say like, hey, we've developed some of these really good coping strategies now. What would it be like if you started using half? What would it be like if you started using less while using these other coping strategies that we have in place? So I think it can be how you approach it is very important. And again, we as professionals, we often operate from the harm reduction. I know as a parent, it can be a little harder to take that approach where you're like, no way, like not in my house. But I think that's kind of where you can pause. You can always consult with professionals and people who work in this field, and they can always help you navigate these waters if you find yourself in them. Yes.
Have you utilized that approach long enough to be able to speak on, is it getting a positive outcome, or is this kind of early on through?
Sure. Well, I think the intention behind harm reduction is really to prevent overdose and death. There's a lot of different trials and different things people do and approaches of it. I would say in the work we do with adolescents, I think it's very beneficial because I think with adolescents, I'm speaking from like a clinical professional perspective, you have to kind of build that rapport and earn that trust with them in a way. And so if I had a 15, 16-year-old who comes in my office and they're like, well, yeah, like I drink on the weekends and then like I'll smoke out with my friends and whatever. And I'm like, oh, well, if you're going to do treatment here, you have to stop all that. Then they'd probably be like, okay, well, then I'm not going to come to treatment. So it'd be like easy decision. So it's kind of that essence of like, I always kind of say you can't like over align with them because you don't want to be like, never mind, it's cool. That's not the approach to take. It's more kind of like, well, we're going to discuss how it's impacting these other things that you're saying you want treatment for. So if you say you're coming in because of anxiety or things like this, I kind of want to know, like, is this playing a part in that? And how is it playing a part in that? So it's kind of really taking that approach of being interested in the client as a person. Like, tell me the story around this. Like, paint me a picture of what it looks like when you're doing this. And often I do think with a lot of the clinicians that I help oversee and I do consulting on their work with, when they've been able to kind of take this approach of like, let's be interested in the person first and understand why this is going on and maybe what started it. Then when they're starting to introduce some of these more reduction techniques and things like that, they are having some good success with them, and they are seeing a reduction in use. Is it 100% of the time? No, because I don't think that is ever like a realistic outcome. I mean, it'd be great, but I think you kind of have to find where, you'll have some people who are never going to use and they're never going to touch the stuff. And then you have some people who are using and they're never going to stop no matter what you tell them. And then there's a lot of people in the middle. And I think it's kind of identifying those people in the middle who you can reach and talk to and being like, hey, let's think of other avenues, because I know your anxiety is debilitating. I know you wake up every day and you don't want to go to school. I know you look in the mirror and you feel this way about yourself. How can we approach that and being like, I understand that when you do this, it makes that feel better. And I want to help you find something that helps it feel better, that's not going to put other things at risk for you.
So for those people in the middle, is that where you're finding a lot of action with either episode that happened, traumatic
Mhm.
stereotype, or there's mental health issues that are under the surface? So there's a reason.
Yeah. Sure. It's really hard to put like a number on that. It's so mixed, I would say. I think it's like anytime you're looking at like substance use in any way, if it's to cope with a mental health condition, or I don't like to say condition, but a mental health symptom or something, you kind of have to look at what is the function of the use. Like, what are we getting out of doing this? And I think that's always what I want to know when I'm talking to somebody who's struggling with it, or that's their function. Is like, what is the benefit that they're experiencing of it? So for some kids, it is something traumatic that happened. For some kids, there is a lot of chaos in the home, and this is something that they do that actually is the only thing that makes them feel relaxed in their house. Or it can be unaddressed mental health symptoms or social anxieties or things like that. Kind of like what I was talking with the stimulants, like social pressures, pressure to perform, things like that. So I think in any situation, there's an unmet need. And that can be hard to identify because, people can have so many underlying unmet needs. But at the same time, I think that's always the mindset I have with it, is kind of like, what is the function here? So yeah, and I do say, there can be very strong social associations with substance use. I know there was someone I didn't do treatment with him. I was just kind of speaking to him at like a thing where I was at a treatment facility and I was getting to meet some of the clients, and he was, I think, like 19 or 20 at the time. But he was like, when I was 16, if you had told me to stop, there was no way I would have done it, because it would have meant I would lose all my friends. So I think you have to kind of consider those things as well, not saying like, oh, well, this is why, or this is okay. But I think it's just the realities of adolescence and those social pressures and what that means to someone's identity. I think you have to kind of respect that space in a sense of that is a very real concern to them. As adults, we might look back at like a group of high school friends that we just had to hang out with. And now as an adult, we're like, well, that doesn't matter because I don't ever see them anymore anyways. But in that time and in that phase of life, that's a very important thing. And then, considering the cost benefit of other mental health and feelings. So this kind of goes back to that unmet need. I think one of the most common questions I get asked, especially in terms of treatment, is like, oh, well, do we treat the substance use first, or do we treat the anxiety and depression first? Do we treat the trauma first? And I'm always kind of like, it's kind of like a chicken or the egg thing. Like, did we start using substances because we had this trauma or this mental health symptom? Or did we start using substances and now because of that, we're having these mental health symptoms? Because as much as people can say like, oh, well, weed relaxes me, we also know that withdrawal from weed spikes anxiety. So that keeps in that cycle of use where it's like, oh, well, now I have to keep using to keep my anxiety down, because the more I use, the more my anxiety gets out of whack. So I think a lot of that can just stem from people's lack of knowledge about all the other effects around different substances and what can happen. And that's where I think a lot of the psychoeducation is really important. And when you're trying to start the conversation, I always just tell parents, like, don't be afraid of the awkward conversations. I know it's awkward, and I mean, even as a therapist, sometimes I can tell something's going on with a client, and I'm like, they're not really disclosing it, but like there's something that's kind of big going on. And sometimes you just have to fumble around with the wording, and it's a little awkward, and it's not pretty, and it's not eloquent or articulate, but that's okay. Because I think it's always better to try to stumble through an awkward conversation than to not ask the questions and then later realize there's been a very serious problem going on that you've been wanting to ask about for months and you haven't done it. I think that's kind of always the way I look at it. It's like, I would rather look like an idiot for a little bit and say all the wrong words and appear very out of touch with anything cool going on in the world than be like, oh, well, I can't talk about it because I don't know enough, or I can't talk about it because I don't know all the right verbiage or whatnot. And I should just say, ask the questions that you feel like you need to ask and that you want to ask. Like, even if it's asking about, does this group of friends, are they involved in something like this? When you go to a party, or they're drinking there, when you go to a party, are people smoking weed? I mean, if you feel like you need to ask these questions, there's probably a reason why you're feeling that way. And I think it's important to not ignore those feelings. I also really encourage parents that, especially parents of adolescents that I've worked with, is you've got to know the rules around substances in your house. And I say this because it is not uncommon that I've had a parent bring a child to treatment and be like, they're using substances, like they're smoking weed and they're drinking alcohol, but then also the parents are smoking weed in the house too. So it's kind of like, all right, well, going back to associations, like they're not really seeing it as a negative thing. They might be seeing it as like a rite of passage. They might be seeing it as like, this is your seat at the table. So you sometimes have to have those really hard conversations, whether it's with yourself or your partner or whoever. If you have somebody in your home that you're really concerned about the risk, you might have to eliminate these things from your house. I know it can get tricky with pharmaceuticals because, sometimes we are taking our own pharmaceuticals for different reasons, whether we need an anti-anxiety or antidepressant for our own treatment. But if you have someone in your home that you're worried about it, I have shown parents where to buy like little lock boxes, get a lock box, put it on the top of a shelf somewhere, and that's where you keep your stuff, but it allows people to not get to it. I think you just have to be really honest about what risk is in your home and what you are worried about encountering, and going from there. Don't be afraid to set limits, whether it's with like cell phones or curfew, social media, and video games. And the reason, sorry, I'm just talking too much. But the reason is because video games are very interactive. People talk on them, they socialize on them. Especially during COVID, the video game, role-playing game was huge because it allowed more connection in a time that people were not connected. But people communicate about all kinds of stuff on video games and social media and things like that. So it's definitely sometimes a way to be doing it under the radar of their parents. If they're like, oh, well, I get like an hour or two of video game time and they're not being monitored in any way. I always just say, kids need supervision, and no matter how old they are, they can earn privacy and things like that. But I think cell phone contracts are very important. You probably have some opinions about this being in 10th grade in the room, like do not take my cell phone from me. Yeah. She was like, do not tell my mom this. But I think it's a very good practice to have your adolescent turn in their cell phone at night, to not keep a cell phone in their bedroom, for different reasons. One, because, they don't need to be scrolling through their phone late into the evening. The scrolling effect. I mean, I struggle with the scrolling if I'm exhausted and burnt out. I love a good TikTok scroll if I'm really tired. But, we don't want that habit to be getting into them. It's not good for their mind. It's not good for their sleep. And there's just access to so much that they don't need to have that exposure to. So I think cell phone contracts are very important. And yeah, I always think too about with like curfews I think those are very important to enforce. One of my grad school professors, she did some study with adolescents. At one point it was around curfew, and she said that this group of girls came into her office, and she was like, the way they were dressed at like noon on a Tuesday, she's like, you would have thought they were about to go clubbing after this interview. They were just, I mean, she's like, they looked amazing, but they were asking them about like what is it like to have limits put on you, and how do you understand that? And she said and they were asking about curfews, and they were like, well, what do you feel about curfews? And this girl goes like, yeah, we need curfews. Look at us. So I think kids know they need those boundaries, and they might resist them, but I think in some ways they also know that they are necessary, and they are absolutely worth enforcing and worth going through those battles. And again, you know, trying to understand the benefit they feel. I know it is I know it's so hard to watch a child struggle with their mental health. My brother, who I'm very close to, has had his own mental health struggles that he continues to deal with. And it's hard to hear those stories. It's hard to hear how debilitating it can be for them at times. But I think at the same time, it's also very important to think like, you know what, how do I walk with them in this, instead of just trying to like tell them like, well, do this, just fix this. Sometimes just sitting with somebody in that darkness and connecting with them is so valuable. There's an author, his name is Johan Hari. He wrote a book called Chasing the Scream, and he has a great TED Talk, and he talks about that the opposite of addiction is connection. And so often, like when we talk about like, you know, like what is the function of that use? Often there is a feeling of disconnect in some way. And people are seeking connection. They want to be connected. And so I think that's about it for what I had for slides. But if you are wanting, I'm open to any questions or thoughts or opinions you have. Feedback, if you feel like you're like, that girl is totally off. Sure.
There's such a thing as a dab. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard that phrase, and I didn't know if it was this dab or something else.
Oh, no, I'll show you. This dab pen. And I also say, if you're wondering, sorry, just going back. If you're wondering how any of this stuff gets used, YouTube is amazing. Yeah. So dab pens kind of look like this. So if you kind of see like here in like, there's like the container where you could either put like the liquid vaping substance. If you're cutting the dabs with the vegetable glycerin, which makes it more liquidy, you put that in there, and then that's how you can smoke dabs in a pen.
And so it's a refillable.
Yeah, it's reusable, just great. It looks like a pen.
Our student section.
Well, how, like, what do you have to say about like, if there's like addiction felt in front of you?
Yeah. I definitely empathize with that. I personally had a lot of that experience in my family, and I think sometimes that's where I find this information very interesting. I think if you've had addiction in your family, I think it's good to assume that you might be predisposed to addiction in some way. I think there are different types of addictions that people are more predisposed to. So for example, like there's uppers and downers. So they're like cocaine would be an upper, like meth would be an upper, downers would be like alcohol or cannabis, things like that. Just because one person in your family was predisposed or struggled with one kind of addiction doesn't mean that you wouldn't necessarily struggle with another. I think sometimes there can be just addictive behaviors, whether it's to video gaming or social media or, yeah, I mean, eat food, there's food addiction. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that we can be like have that addictive pull towards, because what's happening is when we have that addiction in our system, it's kind of like when it gets set off, you start to have these, so you get this big, what's called like a dopamine response. Your brain is like, woohoo, this feels awesome. And what happens when that starts to go away, is you have these receptors in your brain that are like, yoo-hoo, like we need our fix. Doesn't that sound good? And then it kind of starts sending off that signal. And then that's where you kind of start getting that craving and that kind of behavior where you're wanting to go out and find something. And so I think if you have addiction in your family, or if you know someone who does have addiction in their family, I think being aware of that is really important, because I think it's just something in terms of like general health. It's the same thing. If you had somebody who, if you were like predisposed to like diabetes or high blood pressure or something like that, you have to be mindful of what health risks you have. And substance use and addiction is definitely a health risk that people can fall into, and it's very hard to get out of for some people. It's a good question.
Oh, Amelia, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for anything to show up and
Yes.
help us. So, want to thank everyone who might watch this as well. And if you have any questions or need support, you can obviously always reach out to our office at the Family Support Center, or you can reach out and get support through Best Self Behavioral Health as well, and we can help link you with them. But appreciate everybody for coming, and hopefully this was informative, and people can walk away with a little bit of information that might help. So thank you. Take care.